"Hey Gramps, this isn't a shelter," the young waitress said loud enough for the whole cafe to hear, her tone sharp and mocking. A few heads turned, someone chuckled. Leonard Brooks, age 82, stood motionless in the entryway of Franklin Street Café. His coat was clean but worn, his cap unmistakably military. He said nothing, just turned and walked back out into the chill morning air. A gust of wind caught the door as he exited, slamming it shut behind him. The bell jingled violently. Inside, the laughter died quickly, replaced by a brittle hush. The waitress rolled her eyes and mumbled something about weird old guys. Outside, Len paused on the sidewalk. His shoulders, though hunched from age, still carried the outline of someone once built of steel. He adjusted the strap of his canvas bag, which held a folded newspaper and the crossword he worked on every morning. His breath came out in quiet puffs, clouding the air like ghosts he no longer bothered to chase. He didn't look back. The sidewalk stretched before him, cracked and uneven, much like the days he now lived, each step familiar, yet uncertain. He turned left, as he always did, toward the bench near the Veterans Memorial 2 blocks away. He wouldn't get breakfast today, but he still had his thermos. He could sit. Think. Wait for the light to shift in the sky. Routine was still something he had control over, and that small control mattered. Back inside the cafe, a teenager in a hoodie muttered, "Damn. That was cold." His friend shrugged, spooning up cereal. Old guy shoulda known better. The waitress smirked but said nothing more. Outside, Leonard Brooks, sergeant, veteran, widower, survivor, walked on. The war stories were never something Len Brooks shared freely. He didn't have a wall of medals, didn't sit in barbershops retelling heroics, didn't brag. The truth was, most of the memories weren't stories. They were fragments, scenes locked behind his eyes that surfaced when the weather turned or sirens echoed in the distance. He had just turned 18 when he enlisted in 1950. His father, a World War I veteran, had shaken his hand and said only one thing: "Come back with more heart than hate." Len had nodded, not understanding then how thin that line could get. Assigned as a radio operator in the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, Len found himself shipped to Korea in time for the winter offensive. The cold there was something unnatural, air so bitter it felt like it bit through bone. Every breath stung. Every movement cracked the skin. Fingers turned white, then black. He saw men die not from bullets but from exposure, frozen into crouched positions behind ridgelines. Then came the chosen reservoir. The Chinese came like shadows, endless waves crashing against outnumbered and undersupplied Marines and soldiers. Radio lines snapped. Bullets rang out until the sound became part of the wind. Len manned the radio deep into the night, fingers stiff inside fingerless gloves, trying to reach someone, anyone, who would answer. They marched out of that hell. They called it a fighting withdrawal, but really, it was survival. Len carried one wounded man on his back for 2 miles through snow and enemy fire, ducking behind burning trucks, stepping over bodies frozen in the ice. He earned a Bronze Star for that, though he never told anyone but his wife. He came back different, but not broken. And when Vietnam loomed and they asked for volunteers with field experience, he didn't hesitate. This time, he was older. Wiser. The jungle was a different kind of monster, humid, coiled, loud in a way silence never was. He learned to listen in new ways, the crack of a twig, the pause in bird calls, the buzz of flies before gunfire. In Vietnam, he kept others alive. His calm under fire became legend in his unit. When younger soldiers panicked, Len's voice came through the static, steady, unshaken, giving coordinates and orders like a man mapping his own heartbeat. His second Bronze Star came after he guided a medevac chopper into an active combat zone, standing in the open to wave it in under sniper fire. He met his wife, Marlene, between tours. She was a nurse at a VA hospital in Tacoma, Washington, and he'd come in with shrapnel in his leg and a broken radio in his pack. She fixed the leg and took the radio as a souvenir. He never asked her why she kept it. It sat on the mantel for decades, still dented, still silent. They moved to Oregon in the late 70s. A small town. Quiet. Len took up work as a mechanic, eventually opening his own modest garage. Cars made sense: wires, pressure, fuel. You could trace the problem. Fix it. No surprises. He liked that. He never put up military photos in the shop. No patches. No flags. Just a sign: we fix it right or we fix it free. He and Marlene never had children. She couldn't after a miscarriage early in their marriage, and he never pushed. They made peace with it. Filled their lives with neighbors, nieces, godchildren. The 4th of July was always spent on their back porch, grilling and watching the sky light up. She'd squeeze his hand when the loud ones went off. Cancer took her slow and hard. Lung, though she never smoked. Len took care of her every day. Fed her. Bathed her. Read aloud when she could no longer lift her head. She passed just after sunrise one morning, with his hand in hers and no fear on her face. "I'll be at the booth," she whispered. He never quite knew what that meant. After her funeral, he closed the garage for good. Sold it to a former apprentice and moved into a small apartment within walking distance of town. He didn't need much. Just his crossword puzzles, his thermos, and the comfort of Tuesday mornings. Every Tuesday, he walked 3 blocks to the Franklin Street Café. The food wasn't exceptional, but it was always the same. Black coffee, eggs over hard, wheat toast. He sat in the same booth by the window, folded his coat neatly beside him, and did his crossword while the town moved quietly outside. It was his hour. A way to keep the world from sliding too far out of reach. He tipped generously. Always smiled. Spoke little. The staff changed often, but the owners knew him. Or they used to. Lately, faces behind the counter looked younger. Distracted. Less patient. He noticed, but said nothing. What was the point? The last waitress who knew him by name had left 2 months ago. Since then, he'd been greeted with more indifference than warmth. Still, he came. Because routine mattered. Because Marlene would have wanted him to. And then came this morning. He'd worn his military cap because it was Veterans Day, though he didn't expect recognition. It wasn't about that. He'd pressed his coat, polished his boots. Marlene used to tease him, said he looked like he was about to inspect the troops. "One day you'll march back into that cafe like a general," she'd said with a smile. But today, a girl behind the counter had looked up, seen an old man in a military cap, and made a snap decision. She saw someone alone, out of place, unworthy of time or warmth. She raised her voice. Mocked him. Let the room laugh. And Leonard Brooks, who had walked out of frozen death and jungle fire, who had built a life out of quiet honor and steady hands, had simply turned and left. Because some battles weren't worth the noise. But they still left scars. Len didn't walk fast anymore, but his steps that morning had purpose, measured, careful, each footfall hitting pavement like punctuation. The sky had begun to cloud over, muting the colors of the street into shades of gray. He passed a bus stop where no one looked up. Walked by a bookstore he used to visit with Marlene. The window had a Veterans Day sign taped to it, 20% off for heroes, but he didn't pause. Words like hero felt too big, too public. They rarely came when they were needed most. Behind him, the cafe door eased shut again. A chime, a rush of warmer air, then silence. Inside, the waitress with the dyed red ponytail returned to stacking menus behind the counter. She moved quickly, as if her mockery hadn't just sent someone walking out into the cold. She didn't check to see where Len had gone. Didn't care. She popped her gum, tapped the register. A man at the counter raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. The moment had passed. Only it hadn't. The injustice hadn't screamed. It hadn't slammed fists on tables or spilled coffee in outrage. It was quieter than that, more dangerous for how smoothly it slid under the surface. Len hadn't been turned away because of anything he said or did. He hadn't been drunk. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't asked for special treatment. He'd just been old. Alone. A little out of place in a world that moved faster than he did. And for that, a girl not old enough to know what chosen reservoir even meant had decided he didn't belong. That was the worst of it, it wasn't a mistake. Not really. She had looked at him, weighed him with her eyes, and made a choice. Maybe it was the coat. Or the way he stood too long in the doorway, scanning for his usual booth. Or maybe she just didn't want to deal with someone who looked like he might have questions or need patience. Whatever the reason, it wasn't ignorance. It was dismissal. And no one had said a word in his defense. A young man with white earbuds had glanced up when the insult rang out. He'd smirked, almost approvingly, then returned to his phone. A college-age girl chewing on a pencil had flinched, but didn't look up. An older couple near the window had gone stiff, silent, polite, but averted their eyes like guilt might be contagious. Even the cook in the back, visible through the kitchen pass window, had frozen mid-order for a beat before quietly resuming his work. Business as usual. It wasn't that they agreed with the waitress. Most probably didn't. But silence was easier. No confrontation. No awkwardness. Just let the old man leave. Let the moment dissolve into background noise, like it always did. Len had been overlooked before. Many times. It came with age. The world didn't hate the old. It just forgot them. Forgot how much they'd lived. How much they'd done. How much they'd lost. Forgot that the person standing in a frayed coat and military cap might once have stared down death while holding someone else's hand. Might have been 21 and terrified, radioing for help in a war that history books would later condense into a paragraph. The dismissal wasn't about the meal. It wasn't even about the insult. It was about the weight of a life being pushed aside without acknowledgement. About how casual cruelty could be when no one stood to stop it. Inside the cafe, the air had cooled. Conversation resumed, but softer. No one talked about what had happened. The waitress, now pouring coffee for a man in a suit, had gone on with her shift as though she dropped nothing heavier than a sugar packet. But a quiet unease lingered. A teenage busboy, no more than 17, peeked out the front window. He saw the old man walking slowly down the sidewalk, thermos in hand. The boy hesitated, towel draped over his shoulder, lips pressed tight. He didn't know who Len was, but he'd seen something that made his stomach twist, a violation too small to name but too big to forget. He didn't say anything either. But he saw. Back on the street, Len stopped at the Veterans Memorial. It wasn't a grand statue, just a stone slab with names etched into the surface and a small bench beside it. He sat down heavily, placing the thermos beside him. A moment passed. Then another. The wind stirred leaves along the curb. He took off his cap and held it in his lap. He didn't cry. He never did in public. But his jaw clenched hard enough to ache. Somewhere deep in his chest, a knot formed, slowly, steadily, a quiet pressure born of decades where dignity had to be earned again and again just to be seen. The waitress would forget him by the end of her shift. The people who'd watched would likely never speak of it. But the moment had already begun to ripple. 3 tables away, a man who'd once served in Iraq sat thinking about his own father, who never talked about the jungles of Vietnam but flinched every 4th of July. At the counter, the suited man who'd said nothing now watched the waitress with a frown he hadn't worn when he came in. A few glances were exchanged. The young man with the earbuds took them out. The room, previously a stage for laughter and steam, now felt colder. Sometimes injustice echoes not because of how loud it is, but because of how familiar. This wasn't the first time a veteran had been forgotten. It wouldn't be the last. But something about the way Len had turned, silent, no anger, just weary, stuck in the air like unfinished business. The world kept turning. Orders were filled. The register chimed. But something had shifted. And not far away, watching from across the street through a cafe window smeared with steam, someone else had seen it happen. Someone who recognized more than just the shape of a man in a cap. Someone who knew what that patch on his shoulder meant. Someone who wasn't going to let it go. Across the street from the cafe, parked beside a government-issued SUV, 3 Oregon National Guard soldiers waited for their Veterans Day parade briefing. The job was standard: local visibility, light crowd control. Just another calm assignment in a sleepy Oregon town. Captain Eliza Moore sat in the passenger seat, her fingers tapping her coffee cup as she stared across the street. She didn't blink when the cafe door opened and an elderly man stepped out into the cold. His coat was faded, his military cap unmistakable. The quiet in his posture said more than words. "That's a chosen patch," Moore murmured. Sergeant Dave Mills leaned forward from the back seat. "You sure?" Moore didn't take her eyes off the man. "3rd Infantry Division. Frozen chosen. You don't wear that unless you earned it. That man's a survivor." Corporal Isaiah Bennett, seated behind the wheel, squinted toward the cafe. "Frozen what?" "Chosen reservoir. Winter of '50. Korea. Surrounded by hundreds of thousands of Chinese. 40 below. Marines and soldiers clawed their way out. Half of them didn't make it. The ones who did are ghosts now," Mills finished quietly. They watched the man disappear around the corner, his pace slow but steady. Then they turned their attention back to the cafe. Through the fogged glass, they'd seen enough to understand: the waitress had dismissed him. Loudly. No one stopped her. "I hate this part," Moore said. "What part?" Bennett asked. "The part where people forget who built the floor they're standing on." Without another word, she opened the door. Mills followed immediately, his boots hitting the pavement in sync with hers. Bennett grabbed his jacket and jogged to catch up. The trio crossed the street in full uniform, badges, stripes, the solemn authority of soldiers with purpose. Inside, the cafe's door chimed. Conversations paused. The waitress looked up from behind the counter, startled by the presence of 3 uniformed personnel. She straightened. Can I help you?" Moore ignored her. Her eyes scanned the room, the empty booth by the window, crumbs left behind, a coffee ring drying on the table. He had been here. Long enough to sit. Long enough to leave. Mills stepped forward. "We're not here for food." The waitress blinked. "Then, why are you here?" "We saw what happened," Moore said flatly. The waitress crossed her arms. "That guy didn't even speak. He just stood in the way." "That man is Sergeant Leonard Brooks," Moore replied. "Veteran of Korea and Vietnam. Bronze Star. He's seen more in a year than most people will in a lifetime. And this morning, on Veterans Day, he was treated like trash." The room fell into a heavy quiet. "He didn't want a handout," Moore continued. "Just a place to sit. And you humiliated him." "I didn't know who he was," the girl muttered. "You shouldn't have to," Moore said. "Respect isn't reserved for resumes." She turned to Bennett. "Clear that booth. Wipe it down. Nicely." Bennett moved fast, removing napkins and wiping surfaces. Mills helped, stacking empty plates and clearing space like a man setting a table for something sacred. Moore faced the room. This cafe is now closed for the next half hour. Customers, please take your meals to go. No one argued. The few customers quietly stood, some glancing at one another in shame, others nodding in agreement. A woman near the window murmured, "It's the least we can do." Within moments, the cafe was empty. The waitress stared, bewildered. "What gives you the right?" Moore looked at her calmly. "We're Americans. That man outside? He earned this place more than any of us ever will." The girl's mouth opened, then shut again. Moore turned and stepped outside. Across the street, Leonard Brooks still sat on the bench by the Veterans Memorial, cap in his lap, eyes downcast. He hadn't moved. Mills adjusted his collar. "Think he'll come back in?" "We'll ask," Moore said. "But either way, that table stays his." Captain Moore didn't march across the street. She walked, deliberate, respectful, her boots quiet on the cold pavement. She crossed through a thin veil of wind that lifted leaves along the curb and carried the scent of distant wood smoke. The town moved gently in the background, a passing truck, the muffled bark of a dog. But the bench by the Veterans Memorial felt like the center of everything. Len didn't look up. He sat with his hands folded over his cane, his cap resting in his lap. His thermos, unopened, stood beside him like a faithful friend. "Sergeant Brooks," Moore said softly. He turned, slowly, eyes clear and unreadable. "I'm Captain Eliza Moore. Oregon National Guard." He studied her for a beat, then nodded once. "Captain. We saw what happened," she continued. "Back at the cafe." "It's fine," he replied, though his voice didn't carry the conviction to match the words. "It's not," Moore said. She sat beside him without waiting for permission. "Close, but not too close." "I recognized your patch," she added. "Chosen. I studied that campaign in my history coursework at Annapolis. They called it the most brutal winter battle since Valley Forge. Some say it shouldn't have been survivable." Len gave a soft, dry chuckle. "A lot of us agreed." Moore smiled faintly. "I want to invite you back. The booth's ready. No one's in there now. I wasn't looking for trouble." "I know," she said. "But sometimes dignity needs witnesses." He looked at her then. Really looked. She held his gaze. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's go." She stood, offered her arm, not insistently, but present. Len rose slowly, his joints stiff but his pride intact. He didn't take her arm, but he walked beside her. When they stepped back into the cafe, the hush returned. Everything was as Moore had left it. The floor was swept. The air had a strange stillness. The waitstaff stood back, uncertain. A new man in a dark shirt and blazer stood near the counter, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, clearly management. He stepped forward immediately. "Mr. Brooks," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Alex Patel. I manage the cafe. I just got the call a few minutes ago and came straight over." Len nodded but didn't shake. He kept his hands on his cane. "I want to offer a personal apology," Alex continued. "What happened earlier was unacceptable. There's no excuse. The server has been spoken to, and she will not be continuing her shift today." The red-haired waitress stood frozen behind the register. Her jaw was tight, her expression guarded. Len's gaze passed over her. No anger. Just a silence that said more. "I didn't know he was a veteran," she blurted suddenly. Len didn't raise his voice. Didn't change his stance. "You don't have to know someone's past to treat them with respect," he said, each word steady. "You just have to care." She flinched. Said nothing more. Moore guided him gently toward the booth. Bennett and Mills stood like sentries nearby, back straight, watching with quiet reverence. The table had been wiped clean. A fresh setting lay before him, new napkin, fresh silverware, and a still steaming mug of black coffee already waiting. Len slid into the booth slowly. It was his seat again, the same view through the window, the same light falling across the table. Only now, something had shifted. There was stillness in the room, but also gravity. A kind of reverent awareness. More remained standing. "You mind if we sit with you?" she asked. Len gestured at the opposite side. "It's your table too." They sat. Bennett lowered himself gently, hands folded in his lap. Mills leaned his rifle case carefully against the wall and joined without a word. A new waitress, older, brought out his usual order, eggs over hard, wheat toast, and a folded copy of that morning's paper with the crossword puzzle tucked in the fold. She placed it before him with a soft smile. "We're glad you're here, sir." "Thank you," he said. The manager stood nearby. "Mr. Brooks, I was wondering, with your permission, we'd like to formally reserve this booth in your honor. Permanently. A plaque, maybe. For you, and for all veterans." Len looked down at his hands. His fingers trembled slightly. "I didn't come here for any of that." "I know," Alex replied. "That's why it means something." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right." A murmur of quiet approval passed among the small gathering of staff now standing respectfully by the counter. As the meal began, Moore noticed Len had set aside half of his toast. She pointed gently. "Saving that?" He smiled faintly. "Used to be for my wife. Habit." Moore leaned back. "She served. Nurse. VA hospital. Kept a busted radio I carried out of Nam. Still on the mantel." Mills whistled softly. "That's the kind of story they ought to teach in schools." "They won't," Len said. "But maybe someone at that window will see this booth and remember to ask." Later that week, a local carpenter donated a hand-carved wooden plaque. It was mounted just above the window where the light hit every morning. "Reserved for Sergeant L. Brooks, 3rd Infantry Division, in honor of service, sacrifice, and enduring courage. All veterans welcome." The red-haired waitress didn't return. But the young busboy who had watched it all unfold applied to join the guard a month later. And every Tuesday after that, the booth stayed clean. Coffee stayed hot. And more than once, a stranger bought his meal before he even sat down. The weeks that followed passed like ripples in still water, quiet, subtle, but unmistakable in their reach. The plaque at the window booth gleamed under the cafe lights, polished every night before close by whoever was on staff. No one had to be asked. It just became the rhythm. Len continued his Tuesday ritual. Same walk. Same thermos. Same quiet presence. But now, when he stepped through the cafe door, the chime felt different, acknowledged. Heads turned. People nodded. Some stood. Not from obligation, but from recognition. He'd become something unspoken in the heart of the town, not a relic, but a reminder. Not every moment was grand. Most were small. A handshake from a passing construction worker. A thank you whispered by a young mom walking past with a stroller. A napkin left folded with the words, "Thank you for your service," written in blue crayon by a child eating pancakes with her grandfather. Len never asked for any of it. He greeted each with the same quiet humility, offering only a smile or a nod. He still finished his crossword. Still drank his coffee slowly, 2 sips before touching his eggs. But something had settled inside him, a piece deeper than routine. A kind of homecoming that had nothing to do with buildings or addresses. The town changed, too. People began bringing their own veterans in on Tuesdays. One week, it was a retired Coast Guard sailor from Tillamook. Another time, a woman in her 90s who had served in the Army Nurse Corps during World War II. They sat near Len's booth, sometimes waved, sometimes spoke. Other times they just shared the quiet. The cafe manager, Alex, added a new section to the menu, Veterans Breakfast Special, pay what you can. Eat like you served. He kept it small, humble. But the idea spread. Donations covered the cost, and no veteran ever ate alone again. Captain Moore came back often. She and Len didn't always talk, but when they did, the conversations were easy. She told him about her deployments, her love for military history, her frustration with bureaucracy. Len listened, offering the occasional story in return. Usually brief. Always real. One foggy morning, Moore brought a guest, her teenage niece, Nora, who was writing a paper for school on the Korean War. Len invited her to sit. "I don't need the whole war," she said shyly. "Just what it felt like." Len paused. Then said, "Cold. Loud. But mostly. It felt like someone else was counting on you to stay standing. So you did." She wrote that down word for word. The red-haired waitress, whose name turned out to be Tessa, was never seen again at the cafe. Rumor had it she moved to Portland. A few tried to defend her at first. "She's young, she didn't know better," but over time, the town stopped excusing thoughtlessness disguised as youth. The busboy, Eli, joined the Oregon National Guard just 6 months later. Moore wrote his letter of recommendation. On the day he shipped out, he came into the cafe in uniform, saluted Len at the booth, and said, "You're the reason I'm doing this." Len smiled. "Then make sure you do it right." Eli nodded, then added, "I will. I'll listen more than I talk." That made Len laugh. The plaque above the booth became a touchstone. People took photos beside it. Local news did a short segment. Veterans from surrounding towns started making pilgrimages, not because it was famous, but because it was true. There was something unmanufactured about it. Something real. On the first anniversary of that Veterans Day, the cafe hosted a small ceremony. Just a few folding chairs, a quiet bell rung at noon, and a moment of silence. Len said nothing that day. He simply stood in his booth, looked around at the gathered crowd, and touched 2 fingers to his brow in a small, firm salute. Everyone understood. Not long after, Len had a fall in his apartment. Not serious, just a bruised hip, but it kept him home for a few weeks. During that time, Moore visited regularly. She brought him coffee, the crossword, news from the cafe. "You've become a fixture," she said one day, watching him read. "I've always been a fixture," he said. "I was just quieter about it." When he returned to the cafe after recovery, the room broke into soft applause. Len waved it off, sat down, and said, "You're gonna make a man choke on his eggs." Later that day, Moore asked him, "What would you want to be remembered for?" He thought about that. "Not medals. Not the wars. Just that I showed up. When it mattered." She nodded. "You did." Winter came, slow and soft. Len's health declined in fits, a little more fatigue, a slight tremor in his hands. He never made a fuss. Just walked slower. Drank his coffee hotter. Spoke less. One cold Tuesday morning, Moore arrived first. Len didn't come. She waited an hour. Called his number. No answer. Later that day, she went to his building. The landlord let her in. She found him in his chair by the window. Thermos by his side. Crossword on his lap. Peaceful. He had passed some time in the early morning, quietly, the way he lived. The news spread fast. The cafe closed for a day. The plaque was draped in black cloth. Flowers appeared on the booth, roses, flags, small notes. One simply read, "You showed up. When it mattered." The funeral was held 3 days later, with full military honors. Captain Moore gave the eulogy. She read Len's own words aloud: "You don't need to know someone's past to treat them with respect. You just have to care." That night, the cafe reopened. The booth was left empty, set for one. A candle burned on the table. And above it, the plaque stayed just as it was. He mattered.